The stars had never seemed so cold to Ambassador Yuki Tanaka as they did through the viewport of Conclave Station, and she stood with her hands clasped behind her back, while she watched ships from 100 different worlds drift past like metal fish in an endless black ocean conclave. Station was the largest structure humanity had ever encountered, a spinning wheel of metal and light that stretched across 300 kilometers of empty space. And it served as the beating heart of galactic civilization where every major decision affecting 1,000 worlds was made by beings who had traveled between stars while humans were still figuring out fire. She turned away from the viewport where her aide Marcus Chun approached with a tablet in his hands and worry written across his young face. "Ambassador, the Vrakther delegation has arrived early," he said with a slight tremor in his voice that he could not quite hide. "How early?" Tanaka asked. 6 hours, and they have requested an immediate audience with the full Conclave Council. Tanaka allowed herself a small smile that did not reach her eyes because she had studied the Vrakther for 3 years before this mission, and she knew exactly what this early arrival meant. They were establishing dominance before the game had even begun. She straightened her formal jacket and checked her reflection in the dark viewport glass, seeing a woman of 52 years with silver streaks in her black hair and the kind of calm expression that came from decades of negotiating with people who wanted to see her fail. "Then we should not keep them waiting," she said. The walk to the loft Grand Assembly Chamber took 20 minutes through corridors that shifted in gravity and atmosphere to accommodate the dozens of species that called the station home, and Tanaka used every moment to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. The Philippiniste Vrakther had ruled the Galactic Conclave for 12,000 years, not through politics or economics, but through the simple and brutal truth that they had never lost a war against any species they had encountered. They stood 7 feet tall on average, with scales that ranged from deep crimson to a midnight black, covering bodies that seemed carved from living stone, and their forearms ended in hands that could crush metal with casual ease, while their eyes burned with an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly without mercy. When Tanaka entered the Grand Assembly, she saw the Vrakther delegation already seated in the elevated position reserved for the dominant species, and at their head sat High Warlord Kethvaran himself. He was enormous, even by Vrakther standards, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with scales so dark they seemed to absorb the light around him, and the ceremonial scars that covered his chest and arms told stories of 100 battles won through violence that Tanaka could barely imagine. "The human delegation arrives," announced the Methrony herald in a voice that echoed through the vast chamber. Like wind through hollow bones, Tanaka walked forward with her small team of advisors and diplomats, acutely aware that they were the only soft-skinned creatures in a room filled with beings who could tear them apart without breaking stride. "High Warlord Kethvaran," she said with a bow that was respectful but not submissive. "Humanity thanks the Conclave for this opportunity to present our petition for membership." Kethvaran studied her with those burning eyes, and when he spoke his voice rumbled like distant thunder across a battlefield. "The Conclave has received many petitions from many species over many centuries, and we have learned that the universe produces an endless supply of small creatures who believe they deserve a place among the stars." Laughter rippled through the Vrakther delegation, a harsh sound like stones grinding together. "What makes humanity different from the 1,000 other species who came before you with the same desperate hope in their eyes?" Tanaka had prepared for this question, but she knew that no answer she gave would satisfy a being who measured worth in the ability to inflict violence. "We come not as conquerors, but as partners," she said, "seeking to add our strengths to the Conclave and learn from species far wiser than ourselves." "Pretty words," Kethvaran said, leaning forward in his massive throne-like seat. But the conclave does not run on pretty words, and every species must prove their worth through the standards that have maintained galactic order for millennia. He gestured with one of his forearms, and the elderly Methrone stepped forward. Her membrane wings folded tight against her thin body, and her large eyes reflecting the chamber lights like pools of liquid silver. Counselor Illith will oversee the genetic assessment, Kethvaran continued, as she has done for every species seeking membership in the last 300 cycles. Illith bowed her delicate head toward the Vrakther and then toward the human delegation. And Tanaka noticed something in those silver eyes that looked almost like curiosity. The genetic assessment is a formality, Illith explained in a voice like rustling leaves, designed to determine where a species falls within the natural hierarchy of the galaxy, and to assign appropriate roles and responsibilities based on inherent biological capabilities. We understand, Tanaka said, and we are prepared to submit samples from our delegation. That will not be sufficient, Kethvaran interrupted. And the conclave requires samples from your homeworld as well, from individuals representing the full genetic diversity of your species. This was unusual. Tanaka knew because most species only needed to provide samples from their diplomatic team. But she had anticipated that the Vrakther would find ways to complicate the process. We have brought samples from all major population centers on Earth, she said, nodding to Dr. Siren Vasquez, who stepped forward with a sealed container, representing over 50,000 individual genetic profiles. For a brief moment, something flickered across Kethvaran's face that might have been surprise, but it vanished so quickly that Tanaka could not be certain she had. Sinadata Lilith accepted the container with careful hands and examined its seals before looking up at the human delegation with those strange silver eyes. This level of preparation is uncommon, she said, and suggests that humanity takes this process very seriously. We do, Tanaka replied, because we understand that our future in this galaxy depends on proving ourselves to species who have been traveling between stars since before our ancestors left the trees. Kethvaran made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been contempt. At least you understand your place. Human, and that is more than most new species can claim. He stood from his throne, and the movement caused several of the smaller species, representatives in the chamber, to flinch away instinctively. The conclave will reconvene when the genetic assessment is complete, and then we will determine what role humanity will play in our civilization, whether as valued partners or as servants who should be grateful for the opportunity to exist under our protection. The Vrakther delegation filed out of the chamber with the casual arrogance of beings who had never known defeat, and Tanaka watched them go with an expression that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts when the chamber had emptied except for her own team and a few curious observers from other species. Marcus Chen approached her with wide eyes. Ambassador, how can you remain so calm when they speak to us like that? Tanaka turned to look at her young aide, and for the first time since arriving at Conclave Station, she allowed a genuine smile to cross her face. Because I have read our genetic profiles, Marcus, and I know something that High Warlord Kethvaran does not. What is that? That the universe has a sense of humor, and the punchline is about to arrive. 3 days later, Counselor Illith requested a private audience with the Conclave's ruling council. And when she entered the sealed chamber, her membrane wings were trembling in a way that the other council members had never seen before. Counselor, said the Genth representative in a high, nervous voice, you appear distressed. I have run the analysis 17 times, Illa said, and her voice shook like leaves in a storm, using every verification protocol available, and the results remain the same. What results? Kethvaran demanded from his position at the head of the council table. Lith placed her tablet on the table, and the holographic display that rose from its surface showed two genetic sequences side by side with various markers highlighted in different colors. On the left is the standard Vrekthur genome, with dominant sequences highlighted in red, and as you can see, the Vrekthur possess more dominant sequences than any species previously tested, which has always been accepted as the biological basis for your species' natural supremacy, and the right sequence. Asked the Methrony elder who represented that species on the council's wings trembled even more violently. The human genome. And if you examine the highlighted sections, you will notice something that should not be possible. The chamber fell silent as every being present studied the display. And slowly the realization dawned on faces of every shape and color. That cannot be correct, Kethvaran said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. I have verified it 17 times, Illith repeated. And the human genome contains triple the dominant sequences of the Vrekthur, not double, not slightly more, but 3 times the markers that determine aggression, persistence, adaptability, and resistance to psychological surrender. This information does not leave this chamber, Kethvaran commanded. The council chamber had been sealed for 3 hours now, and the silence that hung over the gathered representatives was heavier than the artificial gravity that kept them anchored to their seats, high. Warlord Kethvaran had not moved from his position at the head of the table since Counselor Illith had delivered her impossible findings, and his dark scales seemed to absorb the ambient light until he appeared as nothing more than a shadow carved into the shape of a warrior god. Explain again, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying through the chamber like the rumble before an earthquake. Illith's membrane wings had stopped trembling, but only because she had folded them so tightly against her body that they could no longer move at all. Dominant sequences are genetic markers that determine how a species responds to conflict, stress, and competition, she began, her voice steadier now that she had retreated into the comfort of scientific explanation. And they code for multiple traits including aggression response, territorial instinct, pack bonding under pressure, pain tolerance, and perhaps most significantly, resistance to psychological surrender. We know what they are, growled one of the Vrekthur advisors seated behind Kethvaran. So tell us how these soft little creatures could possibly have more of them than we do. Illith accessed her tablet and projected a new image into the air above the table, showing the evolutionary history of both species, laid out as branching trees of genetic development. The Vrekthur evolved on a world where you were the apex predators from a very early stage in your development, and your dominant sequences developed to ensure that you could maintain control over lesser species and compete successfully with members of your own kind for resources and mates. She gestured, and the image shifted to show a very different evolutionary path. Humans evolved on a world called Earth. And the genetic record tells a story that I confess I found difficult to believe until I verified it through multiple independent databases. What kind of story? Asked the Genth representative, whose species had been subjugated by the Vrekthur so long ago that they had no memory of ever being free. A story of constant, unrelenting death. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to be extinguished. Earth is what xenobiologists classify as a Category 12 death world, Illith continued, which is the highest category we have, and it exceeds the parameters of that category in several significant ways. Kethvaran leaned forward slightly, and his burning eyes fixed on the Methrony scientist with an intensity that would have reduced most beings to trembling submission. The Vrekthur homeworld is classified as Category 9, he said, and we have always been told that no species has evolved on a world rated higher than 10. That information was accurate until we encountered humans, Illith replied, and I have now revised my understanding of what is possible. She brought up a series of images that showed Earth in all its terrifying beauty. From the frozen wastes of its polar regions to the volcanic fury of its tectonic boundaries to the endless blue depths of its oceans where creatures lurked that seemed designed by nightmare. Humans evolved in an environment where everything was trying to kill them, she said. And I mean that quite literally, because the predators were trying to eat them. The prey animals were trying to crush them or poison them. The insects were carrying diseases. The weather was destroying their shelters. The ground was opening up to swallow them. And the water was drowning them, while simultaneously being filled with creatures that wanted to tear them apart. Many species face predators, said the Methrony elder who sat on the council. And that alone does not explain these results. You are correct, Ilith said, which is why I examined the historical genetic record more closely. And what I found was even more disturbing. She brought up a new display showing human population estimates over time. And the assembled representatives watched as the numbers rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost impossible for approximately 200,000 years. Humans existed in small tribal groups competing with each other for resources, territory, and survival. And during this time, they were prey to multiple predator species, while simultaneously hunting those same predators and each other. They hunted each other? Asked one of the smaller species representatives. Extensively, Ilith confirmed. And not just in warfare, but in direct predation, with evidence suggesting that early human groups would hunt and consume members of rival tribes as both a food source and a psychological weapon. The chamber fell silent again as the implications of this sank in. But the most significant factor in human evolution was not the predators or the climate or even their own violence. Ilith continued, but rather their response to all of these threats. What do you mean? Catharan asked. Most species, when faced with overwhelming threat, develop one of two responses. Either they evolve to avoid the threat through speed or camouflage, or they evolve to overwhelm the threat through superior strength or numbers. But humans developed a third response that I have never observed in any other species. She paused, and even the Vreakthur advisors leaned forward slightly in anticipation. They evolved to refuse to die. Ilith brought up the genetic analysis again, highlighting specific sequences that glowed bright red against the backdrop of the human genome. These markers do not code for superior strength or speed or sensory ability. And in fact, humans are significantly weaker and slower than many comparable species on their own planet. But what these sequences code for is something far more dangerous, which is what exactly? Demanded the Vreakthur advisor. Persistence, adaptation, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances. Ilith's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, and her silver eyes were wide with something that might have been fear when a human is injured. These sequences trigger a response that suppresses pain signals and increases aggression, rather than triggering the withdrawal response that most species experience. And when a human is psychologically overwhelmed, these sequences activate backup systems that allow the conscious mind to continue functioning even when every rational instinct is screaming for surrender. You are saying they do not know when to give up, Catharan said slowly. I am saying they are genetically incapable of giving up, Ilith corrected. And this trait was reinforced over 200,000 years of surviving conditions that should have driven them to extinction 1,000 times over. The High Warlord rose from his seat, and his massive form cast shadows across the council table that seemed to swallow the projected images. This information remains sealed, he commanded, and no member of this council will speak of it to anyone outside this chamber. High Warlord, ventured the Gent representative in their nervous high voice. What will you do about the human petition for membership? Catharan was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 12,000 years of unchallenged supremacy. The Vreakthur have maintained order in this galaxy through strength, and our position has never been challenged because no species has ever possessed the capability to challenge us. He turned to face the holographic image of the human genome that still floated above the table. If these creatures truly possess the genetic potential that this analysis suggests, then we cannot allow them to join the conclave as equals, because doing so would invite a challenge to everything our civilization has built. Then what is your proposal? Asked the Methrony elder. The trial of standing, Kethvaran said. And several of the council members gasped at the words. That trial has not been invoked in 6,000 years, protested the Genth representative, because no species has warranted it in 6,000 years. But if humans want a place in our civilization, they will earn it by proving themselves against the standard that the Vrakther have set. And when they fail that trial, they will take their place at the bottom of the hierarchy, where their genetics will be diluted through controlled breeding until these dangerous sequences are eliminated. And if they do not fail? Illith asked quietly. Catharin turned to face her, and his eyes burned with a fire that had conquered 1,000 worlds. Then I will kill their champion myself, and the galaxy will learn once again why the Vrakther rule. The council was dismissed, and the members filed out in subdued silence while Kethvaran remained standing before the holographic display. He did not notice that Illith had lingered behind until she spoke from the shadows near the doorway. You are afraid of them? High Warlord. Kethvaran did not turn to face her, but his voice carried a warning that only a fool would ignore. The Vrakther fear nothing. Counselor, the Vrakther have never encountered a species that evolved on a world more dangerous than their own, Illith replied. And you are wise enough to recognize what that means. She slipped through the doorway and disappeared into the corridor beyond, leaving the High Warlord alone with the glowing image of the human genome, and for the first time in his long and violent life, Kethvaran found himself wondering if the universe had finally produced something that even the Vrakther could not defeat. 2 days later, Ambassador Tanaka received the formal challenge and the terms of the trial of standing. She read them 3 times, and then she called Earth with a single request. There was a man in Montana who had been waiting his whole life. The arena of trials was located at the very center of Conclave Station, a vast circular space that could be reconfigured to simulate any environment from frozen tundra to volcanic hellscape. And it was filled with spectators from every species in the known galaxy. Marcus Cole stood at one end of the arena in simple clothing that left his scarred arms and face visible to all who watched. And across from him, Dreth waited in ceremonial armor that gleamed like polished blood. The Vrakther champion had spent the past week engaging in elaborate displays of strength and skill, designed to intimidate the human before the first trial even began. But Marcus had ignored all of them in favor of quiet meditation in his assigned quarters. This had frustrated Dreth more than any response could have. High Warlord Kethvaran stood on the observation platform above the arena floor, flanked by the members of the Galactic Council who had come to witness humanity's inevitable humiliation. Ambassador Tanaka stood on the opposite platform with Dr. Vasquez beside her, and both women watched Marcus with expressions of carefully controlled tension. The Bakish Methrony herald floated into the center of the arena, a membrane wings catching the artificial light as she raised her thin arms for silence. The trial of standing consists of 7 challenges to be completed over 7 days, she announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast space. And each challenge is designed to test a different aspect of a species' capacity for dominance in the galactic order. She gestured, and a holographic display appeared above her, showing the list of trials. The Day 1 tests pain threshold through the application of neural induction. Day 2 tests endurance through a survival hunt across hostile terrain. Day 3 tests psychological resilience through isolation and sensory deprivation. Days 4 through 6 test combat, strategy, and leadership respectively. And Day 7 tests ultimate, resolved through a final confrontation designed to determine which competitor has the will to seize victory from the jaws of defeat. The herald turned to face each champion in turn. The competitor who wins the majority of trials will be declared victor, and their species will be granted the status earned through their performance. But any competitor may also win by forcing their opponent to surrender at any point during the 7 days. She lowered her arms and floated back toward the edge of the arena. The first trial begins now. 2 devices rose from the floor in front of each competitor. Slender pedestals topped with what looked like metal crowns studded with sensors and neural interfaces. Marcus approached his device with the slow, careful gait of a man who had learned to manage pain with every step, while Dreth strode forward with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. The neural inducers will simulate escalating levels of pain without causing physical damage, the herald explained. And competitors will be eliminated when they can no longer endure the sensation. Dreth lifted his crown and placed it on his head with casual ease. I have endured this test before, he said loudly enough for the entire arena to hear. And my record of 6 hours has never been approached by any competitor from any species. Marcus lifted his own crown and studied it for a moment before placing it carefully on his gray hair. I have not done this particular test before, he said quietly, but I have some experience with pain. The inducers activated simultaneously, and the effect was immediate. Both competitors stiffened as artificial agony flooded their nervous systems, starting at a level equivalent to a minor burn and rapidly escalating to something far worse. The spectators watched in hushed anticipation as the first hour passed with neither champion showing signs of distress. And then the second hour brought the pain to levels that most species found unbearable. Dreth's jaw was clenched and his 4 hands had curled into fists at his sides. But his eyes remained fixed on the far wall, and his stance did not waver. Marcus had closed his eyes, and his face had gone very still in a way that Dr. Vasquez recognized from his medical records as the expression he wore when his body was trying to tell him to stop doing whatever he was doing by the 4th hour. The pain had reached levels that had broken breakthrough champions in the past, and Dreth was showing the first visible signs of strain as sweat streaked his crimson scales and his breathing became harsh. Marcus had not moved at all. The spectators began to murmur among themselves, confused by the human's complete lack of reaction to pain that should have been driving him to the floor in screaming agony by the 5th hour. Dreth's record was in sight, and he was fighting with every ounce of his warrior's pride to maintain his composure. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at his opponent with an expression of mild curiosity. Is the test started? He asked. The murmuring in the crowd became a roar of disbelief, and Kethvaran rose from his seat with his burning eyes fixed on the impossible scene below. Increase the intensity, he commanded. The technicians hesitated, looking to the Methrony Herald for guidance. High Warlord, the current level already exceeds standard parameters by 20%, and increasing it further could risk permanent neurological damage. Increase it, Kethvaran repeated, and his voice left no room for argument. The technicians complied, and the neural inducers pushed both competitors into a realm of suffering that had never been tested. The Fordreth screamed. It was a sound that echoed through the arena like the death cry of a wounded predator, and it was followed by the massive warrior falling to his knees as 6 hours passed, and his record was achieved and surpassed. The crowd was silent now, watching the impossible unfold. Marcus remained standing. His body was trembling, and his face had gone pale beneath the weathered skin. But his eyes remained open and focused, and his legs did not bend. How is this possible? Dreth gasped from his knees, staring up at the human who should have been destroyed hours ago. Marcus looked down at him with something that might have been compassion. When I was 23 years old, he said, in a voice that was steady despite the agony coursing through every nerve. I was captured by enemy forces and held for 17 days while they tried to break me for information I did not have. He took a slow breath as the neural inducer pushed the pain even higher. They used methods that make this test feel like a warm bath. And every day I told myself that I would hold on for one more hour, and then one more after that, and one more after that, until eventually they gave up and left me for dead. Dreth's eyes were wide with something that looked almost like fear. I crawled for 3 days through hostile territory with broken ribs and a shattered hand and burns across half my back. And when I finally reached safety, the medics told me that I should have died at least twice during that journey. Marcus smiled. And it was the smile of a man who had already survived the worst the universe could offer. So when you ask me how this is possible, the answer is very simple, and it is that I have been in worse pain than this on more occasions than I can remember. And every time I decided that dying was not an option. The 9th hour passed, and then the 10th Dreth collapsed completely. Unable to continue despite his warrior's pride and his desperate need to defeat this impossible opponent, Marcus remained standing for 9 more hours. Not because he needed to prove anything, but simply because no one told him to stop. When the technicians finally deactivated his neural inducer, he swayed slightly and then steadied himself with his cane. Was that satisfactory? He asked the stunned arena. The crowd erupted into chaos, with species who had been subjugated by the Vrakther for millennia cheering and shouting, while the Vrakther delegation sat in furious silence on the observation platform. Kethvaran gripped the railing hard enough to leave dents in the metal, and his mind raced with calculations and strategies that all led to the same terrifying conclusion. This human was not normal. This human was something the galaxy had never seen before, and if he could win the remaining trials, then everything the Vrakther had built over 12,000 years would come crashing down like a tower built on foundations of sand. Ambassador Tanaka allowed herself a small smile as she watched Marcus being escorted from the arena by medical staff who seemed more in need of support than he was. Day 1 had been a success, but there were 6 more days to go, and she knew that Kethvaran would not allow humanity to win without throwing every obstacle in their path. The trial of standing had only just begun. Marcus Cole had been living in the mountains of Montana for 7 years now, and every morning he woke before dawn to watch the sun rise over peaks that had stood since before humanity had learned to walk upright. His cabin was small and simple, built with his own hands over the course of 2 summers, and it contained only what he needed to survive, plus a shelf of worn paperback books and a photograph of a woman with kind eyes who had died 3 years before he built the place. He was 62 years old, and his body told the story of those years in a language of scars and aches that never quite went away. The cane he used to walk had been carved from a fallen pine tree, and he needed it most mornings when his left knee reminded him of the shrapnel that had torn through it during a war that most people on Earth had already forgotten. He was making coffee when the transport appeared over the tree line, a sleek government vessel that looked entirely out of place against the rugged wilderness that had become his. Marcus watched it land in the clearing below his cabin, and he did not reach for the rifle hanging above his fireplace because the markings on the Hall told him this was not a threat but something potentially worse. It was an invitation back into the world. He had left behind. The woman who stepped out of the transport was younger than he expected, perhaps 30 years old, with dark skin and intelligent eyes that swept across his property before settling on him with an expression of careful evaluation. "Marcus Cole?" she asked. "Depends on who is asking," he replied. "My name is Dr. Siren Vasquez, and I work with the diplomatic mission to the Galactic Conclave." Marcus took a long sip of his coffee and said nothing. "I know you left the military 15 years ago," She continued, "And I know you came here specifically to get away from anything involving governments or missions or the kind of people who arrive in transports without warning." "Then you know more than most," Marcus said. "And you also know that I am not interested in whatever you are selling." Vasquez climbed the steps to his porch and stood facing him with her hands clasped in front of her in a posture that was respectful but not submissive. "Ambassador Tanaka sent me personally because she believes you are the only person who can help humanity earn a place among the stars." Marcus laughed, and it was a harsh sound that had no humor in it. "I am 62 years old with a bad knee and worse memories. And whatever you think I can do for you, there are 1,000 younger soldiers who could do it better." "We do not need a younger soldier," Vasquez said. "And we need you specifically because of what you have survived." She pulled a tablet from her jacket and held it out to him. And despite his better judgment, Marcus took it and looked at the display. What he saw made him go very still. "These are my medical records," he said. "Complete records from your entire military career and afterward." Vasquez confirmed. And when Ambassador Tanaka reviewed the requirements for the trial of standing, she realized that we needed someone with a very specific profile. Marcus scrolled through the records, seeing the litany of injuries laid out in cold clinical language. 3 major combat deployments resulting in 17 separate hospitalizations, shrapnel wounds to left leg, right shoulder, and lower back 3rd degree. Burns across 20% of body surface, traumatic. Brain injury requiring 6 months of rehabilitation, fractured. Spine with partial paralysis lasting 8 months before recovery. 2 heart attacks during high-stress operations complete. Failure of left kidney requiring transplant nerve. Damage in both hands, severe enough that most doctors had recommended amputation, and those were just the physical injuries, not counting the psychological evaluations that filled 3 separate files with words like severe trauma and chronic stress response and remarkable psychological resilience. "You want me because I have been broken more times than anyone else," Marcus said. "I want you because you have been broken more times than anyone else, and you are still standing," Vasquez replied. "And that is exactly what the trial of standing measures." Marcus handed the tablet back to her and turned to look out at the mountains that had become his sanctuary. "Tell me about this trial," he said. Vasquez explained everything, while the sun climbed higher over the peaks, describing the Vreighther and their 12,000-year dominance over the galaxy. The genetic analysis that had revealed humanity's impossible potential, and the ancient test that would determine whether humans were allowed to rise or forced to serve when she finished. Marcus was quiet for a long time. "The Vreighther champion will be in his prime," he said finally. "And I am old and damaged in ways that do not heal. Yes, the trials are designed to break competitors in body and mind and spirit, and there is a very real chance I will die before they are complete. Yes, and you are asking me to represent the entire human species in a contest that will determine our fate in the galaxy." "Yes." Marcus set down his coffee cup and reached for his cane. And when he stood, the morning light caught the scars on his face and hands in a way that made them shine like silver threads woven through weathered leather. "When do we leave?" he asked. Vasquez blinked in surprise, clearly having prepared a much longer argument to convince him. "You are agreeing, just like that?" "I spent 15 years in wars that meant nothing, fighting for causes I did not believe in and watching friends die for reasons that made no sense. And then I spent 7 more years hiding from a world that had no use for a broken old soldier." He walked to the edge of his porch and looked out at the mountains one last time. "Now you are telling me that everything I have survived, every injury and every scar, and every night I spent wondering why I was still alive when better people were dead, all of it might actually mean something." He turned back to face her, and his eyes held a fire that Vasquez had only seen in the records from his most desperate battles. I have been waiting my whole life for someone to tell me that getting knocked down and getting back up was not just stubbornness, but something that mattered. And if humanity needs an old wolf to show the galaxy what we are made of, then I am ready to run one more hunt. 3 days later, Marcus Cole stepped off a transport onto the deck of Conclave Station and found himself surrounded by beings from 100 different worlds. Most of them looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. Seeing only a gray-haired human with a cane who seemed completely out of place among the giants and warriors that filled the station, the Vrakther delegation was waiting. And at their head stood High Warlord Kethvaran himself. The massive warrior studied Marcus with eyes that had evaluated 1,000 opponents. And what he saw clearly amused him. "This is your champion?" he asked Ambassador Tanaka, who stood beside Marcus with her diplomatic mask firmly in place. "This is Marcus Cole, veteran of 3 major combat operations and survivor of more physical trauma than any other member of our species on record." Kethvaran made a sound that was unmistakably laughter. "He can barely walk." "Ambassador, and you expect him to face the trial of standing against Dreth, the finest warrior the Vrakther have produced in 3 generations?" A younger Vrakther stepped forward at the mention of his name, and Marcus evaluated him with the practiced eye of someone who had faced death in 100 different forms. Dreth was 7 feet tall with crimson scales and muscles that rippled beneath his skin like coiled serpents waiting to strike, and his forearms were covered in ceremonial scars that marked him as a warrior of the highest caste. Looked at Marcus the way a predator looks at prey. "That is too small to be worth the effort of killing. I will try not to break him too quickly," Dreth said, "because it would be a shame if the trial ended before the other species could see what happens when humans overreach their place in the natural order." Marcus leaned on his cane and looked up at the towering warrior with an expression of mild interest. "You have nice scars," he said in a conversational tone. Dreth's eyes narrowed at the unexpected response. "Each one marks a victory in ritual combat," he said, "and they number more than 50. "That is impressive," Marcus replied. "And I stopped counting my scars when they covered more than half my body, because after that, it seemed like too much effort to keep track." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side with nothing left to lose. "But I am sure we will have plenty of time to compare notes during the trial, assuming you can keep up with an old man who can barely walk." The laughter died in Kethvaran's throat as he watched this exchange, and somewhere in the back of his ancient warrior's mind a voice whispered a warning that he did not yet fully understand. This human was not afraid. A creature with no fear was either insane or dangerous beyond measures. Trial of standing would begin in 1 week, and the galaxy was about to learn which one Marcus Cole truly was. The second trial took place on a moon that the Conclave maintained specifically for testing the survival capabilities of prospective member species. A hostile wilderness of dense jungle and volcanic terrain that stretched across an area larger than most planets' inhabited continents. Marcus and Dreth were dropped at opposite ends of a 200-kilometer course with minimal equipment and a single objective: reach the finish point before your opponent, the Vrakther champion, had recovered from his humiliation in the first trial with a cold fury that burned in his eyes like distant stars going supernova. And he launched himself into the jungle with the speed and power of a predator who intended to prove that his loss had been nothing more than an aberration. Marcus watched him disappear into the vegetation and then turned to examine his own surroundings with the careful attention of someone who had survived hostile environments before. The jungle was alive with sounds that he did not recognize. Creatures calling to each other in the dense canopy above, and something larger moving through the undergrowth in the distance. And the air was thick with humidity and the smell of alien vegetation that made his human lungs work harder than usual. He checked his equipment. A small pack containing water purification tablets, a knife, a length of rope, and a single ration bar that would provide enough calories for perhaps 6 hours of moderate activity. The Vrakther had received the same equipment, but their biology gave them significant advantages in this environment, including superior speed, enhanced night vision, and a metabolism that could sustain high-intensity activity for far longer than any human. Marcus knew all of this. And he also knew that trying to match Dreth's pace would be suicide, so he did what he had always done when faced with impossible odds. He found another way. Instead of racing through the jungle in a desperate attempt to keep up with his opponent, Marcus moved at a steady walking pace that conserved his energy and allowed him to observe his surroundings. He noted the direction of the sun and the patterns of the wind and the behavior of the creatures that fled in his approach, building a mental map of the terrain that would help him navigate when darkness fell. By the third hour of the hunt, Dreth had covered nearly 80 kilometers and was well ahead of the human according to the tracking devices that broadcast both competitors' positions to the observers on Conclave Station. The Vrakther delegation was celebrating, certain that their champion would redeem himself in this trial that played to all of his natural strengths. But Marcus was not concerned with the current standings. He was concerned with the terrain ahead. The course had been designed to channel competitors through a narrow canyon system during the final 50 kilometers, a geological feature that would favor the faster and stronger competitor in a direct race. But Marcus had noticed something during his careful observation of the environment, a subtle pattern in the vegetation that suggested an alternative route. He changed direction slightly, moving toward a ridgeline that paralleled the main course at a higher elevation. What is he doing? Ambassador Tanaka asked Dr. Vasquez as they watched the tracking display. I do not know, Vasquez admitted. But Marcus has survived situations that should have killed him a dozen times over, and he has never done it by following the obvious path. Dreth continued to burn through the jungle at a punishing pace, his forearms swinging in perfect coordination as he cleared obstacles and crushed anything too slow to get out of his way. By the 10th hour, he was exhausted but still moving. Driven by the fury of his previous defeat and the absolute certainty that he could not lose again, he emerged from the jungle into the canyon system and slowed slightly, as the narrow walls forced him to follow a more constrained path. That was when he heard the rumbling. The sound came from above, a deep grinding roar that seemed to shake the very rock beneath his feet. And Dreth looked up just in time to see a wall of water crashing down through the canyon toward him, a flash flood, triggered by the volcanic activity that was common in this region and channeled through the narrow canyons with devastating force. Dreth ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his warrior's instincts screaming at him to escape the water that was swallowing everything in its path. And he barely managed to scramble up a rock face to safety before the flood reached him. He clung to the rocks, gasping for breath and watching as the water raged past, carrying debris and vegetation and anything else unfortunate enough to be caught in its path. When it finally subsided, he found that the canyon floor had been transformed into a muddy swamp that would take hours to navigate on the ridgeline above. Marcus Cole emerged from the tree line and looked down at the devastated canyon with an expression of grim satisfaction. He had seen the signs of impending flood during his observation of the environment. The particular color of the volcanic steam, the behavior of the local animals fleeing to higher ground, and the slight tremors that preceded the water's release. He had climbed to the ridgeline where the flood could not reach him. And now he had a clear path along the elevated terrain, while Dreth struggled through the mud below the observers. On Conclave Station erupted into chaos as they realized what had happened. He anticipated the flood. Counselor Illith breathed, her silver eyes wide with amazement, and he adjusted his route to avoid it while allowing his opponent to be caught. "That is cheating," protested one of the Breakthrough advisors. "The rules specify that competitors must reach the finish point before their opponent," Illith replied, "and there is no restriction on how they may achieve this goal." High Warlord Kethvaran said nothing, but his burning eyes tracked the human moving steadily along the ridgeline with an expression that had shifted from contempt to something far more dangerous: respect and fear. The hunt continued through the night, with Dreth fighting his way through the flood-ravaged canyon while Marcus maintained his steady pace along the high ground. By the 20th hour, the Breakthrough champion was showing signs of severe exhaustion, his movements becoming slower and less coordinated as his body demanded rest that his pride would not allow. Marcus was tired too, his old bones aching and his bad knee sending shooting pains up through his leg with every step. But he had learned long ago how to function when his body wanted to stop. He had survived 17 days of torture and 3 days of crawling through hostile territory. He could handle a long walk by the 25th hour. Dreth could barely stand, his superior biology finally reaching its limits after a day and a night of maximum exertion with minimal rest. Collapsed in the mud of the canyon floor, his forearms sprawled at his sides, and his eyes staring up at the sky with the hollow look of someone who could not understand how things had gone so wrong. Marcus walked past him an hour later, having descended from the ridgeline. Now that the canyon floor was passable, he stopped beside the fallen Breakthrough and looked down at his opponent with an expression that held no triumph, only a quiet understanding. "You are faster than me," Marcus said, "and stronger, and better adapted to this environment in every way that should matter." Dreth said nothing, too exhausted even to respond. "But you ran at maximum speed for as long as you could, burning through your reserves like they were unlimited. And when the flood hit, you had nothing left to adapt." Marcus reached into his pack and pulled out his ration bar, which he had been saving for exactly this moment. He broke it in half and dropped one piece beside Dreth's head. "I have been racing against my own limitations my entire life," he said. "And I learned a long time ago that the winner is not always the fastest or the strongest, but sometimes just the one who is still moving when everyone else has stopped." He walked on toward the finish point, leaving the Breakthrough champion alone with the stars. 3 hours later, Marcus crossed the finish line and claimed humanity's second victory in the trial of standing. And across the galaxy, species who had never dared to challenge the Breakthrough began to whisper among themselves about the strange soft creatures from Earth who seemed to have been built specifically to refuse to die. The third trial was called the Void Chamber, and it was considered by many species to be the most terrifying of all the challenges in the trial of standing. Competitors would be placed in complete isolation, cut off from all sensory input, including light, sound, touch, and even the awareness of their own bodies through careful neural suppression. And they would remain there until they either surrendered or went mad. The Breakthrough had always excelled at this trial because their warrior culture trained them to endure mental hardship through sheer force of will. And Dreth had survived 4 days in the Void Chamber during his qualification trials. But Dreth was no longer certain of anything after his defeats in the first 2 trials. And as he entered his isolation pod, he felt something he had never experienced before. Marcus entered his own pod on the opposite side of the chamber. And when the technicians began attaching the neural suppressors that would cut him off from all sensation, he closed his eyes and prepared himself for what was coming. "The trial begins when both competitors are fully isolated," announced the Methrony Herald. "And it ends when one competitor signals surrender or when the monitoring systems detect signs of psychological breakdown. The pod sealed and darkness descended for Dreth. The first hours passed in disciplined silence as he retreated into the meditation techniques that every breakthrough warrior learned from childhood, building walls around his mind and filling the emptiness with memories of glory and conquest. But as the hours stretched into days, those walls began to crack. The emptiness was not passive, it was hungry, and it gnawed at the edges of his consciousness with patient inevitability. He began to hear voices that were not there. Whispers from enemies he had killed and comrades who had fallen, and the dark possibilities of failure that every warrior carried buried deep in their hearts. By the second day, he was fighting a battle against his own mind, struggling to maintain the certainty that had defined his entire existence. By the third day, he was screaming into the void, but no sound came out because his vocal cords had been suppressed along with everything else. By the fourth day, he was curled into himself like a frightened child, whimpering at shadows that existed only in the broken fragments of his psyche. Monitoring systems detected the first signs of breakdown at the 4-day mark, and the breakthrough delegation watched in horrified silence as their champion's vital signs spiraled toward catastrophe. On the observation platform, High Warlord Kethvaran stood with his 4 hands clenched at his sides and his burning eyes fixed on the display, showing Dreth's deteriorating condition. "He must hold," he said through gritted teeth, "because the human cannot possibly last longer than a trained breakthrough warrior." But in the other pod, Marcus Cole was experiencing something very different. He floated in the darkness with his eyes closed and his mind calm, and the emptiness that surrounded him felt almost like an old friend. This was not the first time he had been alone with nothing but his own thoughts for company during his 17 days of captivity. There had been stretches of isolation between the torture sessions, hours and sometimes days when he was left in complete darkness with only the pain of his injuries to remind him that he still existed. He had learned during those dark hours that the mind could be either an enemy or an ally, and the difference depended entirely on how you chose to use it instead of fighting the emptiness. Marcus embraced it, let his thoughts wander through the landscape of his memories, visiting the faces of people he had loved, and places he had been, and moments that had mattered in a life that had been marked by more pain than most people could imagine. He thought about his wife Elena, who had died of cancer 3 years before he built his cabin in Montana, and the way she had smiled at him on the morning of their wedding day. He thought about the soldiers he had served with over 3 decades of military service, the ones who had lived and the ones who had died, and the wished ones who still carried the weight of their experiences the same way he did. He thought about the mountains of Montana and the sunrise over the peaks and the silence of the wilderness that had helped him find peace after so many years of war, and he thought about why he was here, in a pod of sensory deprivation surrounded by aliens who wanted to see him fail, representing a species that was counting on him to prove their worth. The hours passed, and then the days, and Marcus continued to float in the darkness with a serenity that the monitoring systems could not explain. His brain activity is within normal parameters, reported the Methrony technician monitoring the trial. And in fact, his stress indicators are lower now than when he entered the chamber. "That is impossible," said one of the breakthrough advisors. "I am simply reporting what the data shows," the technician replied. "And according to all measurements, the human appears to be completely at peace." On day 5, Dreth's monitoring systems triggered an emergency extraction, and the breakthrough champion was pulled from his pod in a state of complete psychological collapse. He was screaming when they opened the seal, screaming at things that were not there and clawing at his own scales, as if trying to tear away enemies that existed only in his shattered mind. It would be 3 days before he recovered enough to speak coherently, and even then the haunted look in his eyes suggested that some part of him would never fully return from the void. Marcus remained in his pod on day 6, Ambassador Tanaka requested a communication with him through the pod's audio systems, wanting to confirm that he was still functioning. "Marcus, can you hear me? The trial is over. You have won. You can come out now." There was a long pause, and then Marcus's voice came through the speakers, sounding calm and slightly puzzled. "Already?" I was just starting to relax. He emerged from the pod, looking tired but whole, blinking in the sudden light of the chamber and stretching muscles that had been motionless for 6 days. The medical team rushed to examine him, expecting to find signs of the psychological damage that should have been inevitable after such extended isolation. But their scans showed nothing abnormal. "How is this possible?" demanded Kethvaran, who had come down from the observation platform to witness the human's emergence. Personally, Marcus looked at the High Warlord with an expression of genuine consideration. "When I was young," he said, "I thought that the worst thing in the world was being alone. And I fought against it with everything I had, filling every moment with noise and activity and the company of others." He accepted a drink of water from one of the medical staff and continued, "Then I was captured. And I spent 17 days in darkness between torture sessions with nothing but my own mind for company. And I learned that solitude is not the enemy." He set down the water and met Kethvaran's burning gaze directly. "The enemy is what you bring into the silence with you. And if you spend your whole life running from the parts of yourself that frighten you, then the silence gives them room to grow. But if you learn to face those parts and accept them, and make peace with who you really are, then the silence becomes a refuge instead of a prison." He smiled. And it was the smile of a man who had long ago stopped being afraid of his own shadow. "I have spent 7 years living alone in the mountains, talking to no one but myself. And I have had plenty of time to work through my demons. So, when you put me in that pod, I was not trapped with my fears. I was simply back in familiar company." Kethvaran stared at the human for a long moment, and the fury that had been building in his chest was slowly replaced by something else. This creature was not merely surviving the trials. He was demonstrating something that the Vrakther had never considered. Possible dominance through inner peace. It was a contradiction that shattered everything Kethvaran thought he understood about strength and power, and what it meant to rule the galaxy. High Warlord turned and walked away without another word, and the Vrakther delegation followed in shocked silence behind them. Ambassador Tanaka approached Marcus with a smile that was both proud and concerned. "That is 3 victories out of 3, she said. "And you only need 1 more to secure humanity's place in the conclave." "I know," Marcus replied. "And that is what worries me, because Kethvaran will not let this end without throwing everything he has at us. And I have a feeling the worst is yet to come." He looked toward the exit where the Vrakther had disappeared. "A cornered predator is the most dangerous kind, and we have just backed the most powerful species in the galaxy into a corner from which there is no escape." Tanaka nodded gravely. "Then we will be ready for whatever comes." "We have to be," Marcus said, "because I did not survive everything I have survived just to fail at the finish line." He picked up his cane and began walking toward the exit, already preparing himself for the trials that remained 4 days down, 3 to go, and somewhere in the depths of Conclave Station. High Warlord Kethvaran was planning something that would make everything that came before look like a gentle warm-up. The first blow shattered Marcus's shoulder and sent him crashing into the metal wall with enough force to dent the surface behind him. He had known from the moment he accepted this challenge that he could not win through strength or speed, or any of the conventional means by which victories were typically measured, because Kethvaran was quite simply the most dangerous physical opponent he had ever faced. But Marcus had not survived 3 decades of warfare and 15 years of rehabilitation. By fighting fair, he pushed himself off the wall and dodged the follow-up strike that would have crushed his skull. Rolling beneath the High Warlord's massive arms and coming up behind him with a kick aimed at the back of his knee. It was like kicking a steel beam. Kithvaran barely noticed the impact. Spinning with terrifying speed and catching Marcus with a backhanded blow that lifted him off his feet and threw him across the chamber. He landed hard, feeling something crack in his chest, and for a moment he lay still as his body screamed at him to stop. "You cannot win this fight," Kithvaran said, stalking toward him with the casual confidence of a predator who knows its prey is already dead. "And your genetic potential means nothing when faced with superior physical capability." Marcus spat blood onto the floor and forced himself to his hands and knees. "Maybe not," he said, "but I can make sure you remember it." He lunged forward, not at Kithvaran but at the wall beside him, grabbing a loose panel that had come free during his earlier impact and swinging it with both hands into the High Warlord's face. The makeshift weapon shattered against Kithvaran's scales, doing little damage but forcing him to blink and turn away from the debris. Marcus used that moment to drive his knee into the junction where Kithvaran's arm met his torso, targeting the nerve cluster that he had noticed during the breakthrough ceremonial demonstration. Skant grunted in surprise as his right primary arm went temporarily numb. And that surprise was enough for Marcus to land 3 more strikes to the same area before the High Warlord recovered and caught him with a grip that threatened to crush his spine. "Clever," Kithvaran admitted, lifting Marcus off the ground with one hand while his numb arm slowly regained feeling. But not clever enough. He threw Marcus into the center of the chamber with contemptuous ease. Marcus tried to rise, but his legs would not cooperate, and he realized with cold clarity that the fight was over. His body had nothing left to give. Kithvaran stood over him, his burning eyes looking down at the broken human with something that might have been respect. "You fought well for such a fragile creature," he said, "and I will make your death quick as a reward for your courage." He raised all 4 arms for the killing blow, and Marcus laughed. It was a harsh sound, born of pain and exhaustion and something else that Kithvaran did not immediately recognize. "What is amusing about your death?" the High Warlord demanded. "Nothing," Marcus said, still laughing even as blood trickled from his mouth. "But I just realized something that you have not figured out yet." "And what is that?" Marcus looked up at the towering warrior with eyes that held no fear, only a quiet certainty that came from somewhere deeper than muscle or bone. "You already lost." Kithvaran's eyes narrowed. "Explain yourself." "Human, because you are the one lying broken on the floor while I stand victorious." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "And you are about to kill me, which means you could not accept the result of the official trial and had to resort to an illegal challenge to maintain your pride." He coughed, and more blood came up, but he kept talking. "When you kill me, everyone in the galaxy will know that the Breakthrough was so afraid of a single damaged human that their greatest warrior had to murder him in secret rather than accept defeat with honor." Kithvaran was very still. "Now, they will know that your 12,000 years of dominance meant nothing, because when the moment of truth arrived, you were too weak to face it." Marcus smiled, and his teeth were stained red. "I came here knowing I would probably die, and I accepted that because some things are worth dying for. But you came here thinking you could preserve your empire through violence, and instead you are about to destroy everything the Breakthrough have built." He closed his eyes. "So go ahead and kill me, because my death will mean humanity's rise, and your victory will be the beginning of your end." The chamber was silent. Days 4 through 6 of the Trial of Standing were designed to test the skills that the Breakthrough valued above all others: combat, strategy, and leadership. They would be the most brutal days of the entire trial, and everyone watching knew that this was where Dreth would finally have the advantage. He needed to turn the tide. The Breakthrough champion had recovered from his psychological collapsed with a cold determination that was almost more frightening than his previous fury. And when he entered the combat arena for day 4, his eyes held nothing but the absolute certainty that he would win or die. Trying Marcus Cole entered from the opposite side, walking with his cane and looking very much like a man who had no business facing a 7-foot warrior in single combat. The rules of the combat trial were simple. No weapons, no armor, and no killing. But everything else was permitted. The fight would continue until one competitor was unable to continue or surrendered. "Begin," announced the heraldrith, moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them in the space of a heartbeat and swinging one of his massive arms in a strike that should have taken Marcus's head from his shoulders. Marcus was not there. He had dropped low and rolled to the side the instant Dreth began his charge. And the Vrakthar's fist struck empty air where the human had been standing. Dreth spun and attacked again, unleashing a flurry of strikes from all 4 arms that would have overwhelmed any opponent who tried to block or parry. Marcus did not try to block, he moved, constantly moving, using every trick he had learned in 3 decades of military service and a lifetime of surviving. Against superior opponents, he ducked under a swing, sidestepped a kick, rolled beneath a grab that would have crushed his ribs, and somehow managed to stay one step ahead of the assault through sheer desperate improvisation. But he could not keep it up forever. Dreth caught him with a glancing blow to the shoulder that sent him spinning across the arena floor. And before Marcus could recover, the Vrakthar was on him with a kick that connected with his bad knee and dropped him to the ground screaming. The crowd roared as Dreth raised all 4 fists to deliver the final blow. Certain that victory was finally within reach, Marcus looked up at his opponent with blood on his lips and pain blazing through his shattered knee. And he smiled, and he grabbed a handful of dust from the arena floor and threw it directly into Dreth's eyes. The Vrakthar stumbled back, temporarily blinded, and Marcus used the precious seconds to drag himself across the floor toward the arena wall. He could not stand, could not run, could barely move at all with his knee destroyed. But he kept moving anyway, because that was what he had always done. Dreth cleared his eyes and saw the human crawling away. And something about the sight made him hesitate. "Surrender," he said, his voice echoing through the silent arena. "Because you cannot win this fight, and continuing will only cause you more pain." Marcus pulled himself up against the wall, using it for support as he faced his opponent on his one good leg. "I have been told that before," he said through gritted teeth, "by people who were better at killing than you. And I am still here." Dreth charged again. But this time, Marcus was ready. He pushed off from the wall at the last possible moment, driving his forehead directly into Dreth's face with every ounce of strength he had left. The impact was brutal, cracking bone and sending both competitors crashing to the ground. They fought in the dust like animals, tearing and clawing and biting with no technique and no strategy. Just 2 creatures trying to destroy each other through pure savage determination. Marcus broke 3 of his fingers on Dreth's scales. Dreth crushed 2 of Marcus's ribs with a grip that would have killed a lesser Manthi. Separated briefly, both gasping for breath and bleeding from dozens of wounds. And then they crashed together again by the time the medical teams finally separated them. Both competitors were barely conscious. Dreth had won on points because he had inflicted more damage. But the victory felt hollow. The human had refused to surrender despite injuries that should have rendered him unable to fight. And in the end, it had taken 4 Vrakthar warriors to drag Marcus away because he kept trying to get back up. Day 5 brought the strategy trial, a complex simulation where each competitor commanded a virtual army against their opponent across a holographic battlefield. Dreth was a natural tactician, trained from birth in the art of warfare, and he should have crushed the human in a matter of hours. Instead, the battle lasted for 18 hours. Marcus lost, but only barely, and only because his armies had been worn down through a war of attrition that cost death. Far more resources than he could afford, the Vrakther delegation watched in growing horror as their champions. Forces were bled dry by tactics they had never seen before, designed not for victory, but for inflicting maximum damage in defeat. He is not trying to win, Counselor Illith observed from her position beside Ambassador Tanaka, because he is trying to make sure that even in losing, he takes as much as possible with him. That is the human way, Tanaka replied. And it is why we have survived as a species, despite being weaker and slower than almost everything else on our planet. Day 6 was the leadership trial, where each competitor was given command of a team of volunteers from various species and tasked with completing a series of objectives in a simulated crisis scenario. Dreth commanded his team with the iron authority of a Vrakther warlord, demanding absolute obedience and punishing any failure with harsh discipline. His team was efficient but terrified, completing their objectives with mechanical precision while constantly looking over their shoulders for signs of their leaders. Displeasure Marcus commanded his team very differently. He learned their names and their strengths and their fears, and he adapted his approach to each individual, giving some clear, direct orders while allowing others the freedom to solve problems in their own way when they made mistakes. He helped them understand what went wrong and how to do better when they succeeded. He made sure everyone knew who deserved the credit. His team was not as fast as Dreth's, but they were more creative, finding solutions to problems that the Vrakther team simply muscled through. And at the end of the trial, when the scores were tallied, Marcus won by a narrow margin. 4 victories to 2. Humanity had secured its place in the Galactic Conclave. But as Marcus limped away from the leadership trial, with his borrowed team cheering behind him, he knew that the fight was not over. The official trials had ended, but the real battle was just beginning, because High Warlord Kethvaran would never accept this defeat that night. Marcus was summoned to a private meeting in a section of the station that was not on any official map. He went alone, despite Ambassador Tanaka's protests, because he understood what was happening. Kethvaran was waiting in a chamber that had been stripped of all decoration, leaving only bare metal walls and a floor that showed the stains of old violence. "You have won the trial of standing," the High Warlord said, his voice empty of emotion. "And according to the ancient laws, humanity is now entitled to equal standing in the Galactic Conclave. But you are not going to accept that," Marcus said. "I am offering you a choice," Kethvaran replied, "because you can accept a reduced status for humanity, something better than servitude but less than equality, and in exchange I will spare your life. Or you can face me in single combat and we will settle this the old way." Marcus looked at the towering warrior, at the ceremonial scars covering his body and the muscles that could tear a human apart without effort, and he thought about everything he had survived to reach this moment. "If I win," he asked, "then humanity takes its place among the stars as equals or greater, and the Vrakther will accept your supremacy without question. And if I lose, then you die, and humanity remains where they belong, at the bottom of the hierarchy, serving species who are better than they are." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he took off his jacket and laid down his cane. "I accept," Kethvaran smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "Then let us finish this."